Well, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I must apologize. I have a bit of a cold. If I break out coughing and I lose my voice, that's the reason. Bear with me, and I will try and recover. And I'll see if I can get through the whole presentation without failing. The title, yeah, is a bit complex, and I hope I will have something useful for some of you during the presentation, some words of wisdom, or some advice which may be helpful to you in your future career. But I'd like to go back to the beginning. So part one is about the accessible and random Gooey blob. Now, the Gooey blob is a creature, a thing, an entity which has appeared in 4 of my games now, believe it or not. But it all goes back to a game that I started making in 1981. So the origin of this game goes back to this board game, which was published by Games Workshop in 1980. And it was a board game about fighting wizards. And I was watching kids play it at school, and they were playing with each other, and they wouldn't let me play it. And I thought, well, screw them. I can make my own wizard game, and it's going to be better than this one, because this one was very static. You didn't have a board to move things around, and you just placed your wizard. It was very complicated. It had all these numbers and stuff. So I thought, well, I'm going to make my wizard game, and it's going to be better. And it kind of ended up a bit like this. Okay, this is the original wizard game, as I called it then, that I made in 1981. And it used cards, like the Games Workshop game. But the thing is that when you summoned the creature, you placed it on a board, and you moved these creatures around the board, and your wizard was also a card that you placed on the board, and it had a lot more positional or dynamic aspects to the game. And you can see this was handmade with a typewriter. It doesn't look too good these days, but I've still got it. And the Gooey blob is over here on the left, glutinous blob, as it was called then. And its speciality was that when you summoned it, it spread around randomly on the map, and it engulfed your enemies and trapped them, and you laughed as they squirmed, trying to get out of your trap. So the Gooey blob was like a sort of fire and forget missile. Now, what I did later on was when I got my 48K Sinclair ZX Spectrum, I started working on games straight away. And when I learned assembly language, the first game that I worked on then was a computer adaptation of my earlier board game, which became known as Chaos. The irony being that it was actually published by Games Workshop, who actually published that board game that I was inspired by earlier to do better with. And it was very close to the original board game in terms of the spells and the creatures and the way it worked. But I did add a very interesting mechanic, a little innovation, which could only really be done on computers, and that was the illusion bluff mechanic, where you could summon a creature with 100% casting chance. There was an illusion, and other wizards can disbelieve that illusion. So it created a very interesting poker-like game of bluff. And of course, it also had AI. This was the main advantage that I saw with adapting my computer game designs, my board game designs to computer, was that I can add an AI. And it had up to 8 players could play this game, any or all of which could actually be AI players. So that made it quite interesting from that point of view, because there wasn't any other game that was really trying to do this at the time. And I was working on this in 1984, published in 1985. And one of the interesting things about the game was that after it disappeared in obscurity, because after Games Workshop published it, I didn't earn much money from it. It wasn't a commercial success. I then had the game released on a cover tape of Your Sinclair magazine, which is probably where most people were exposed to the game. And then later on, still, there were people who were saying how good this game was, and I didn't really appreciate what they thought about it. There's a few quotations from actual players of the game. It worked very well as a multiplayer game. It worked with both adults and kids playing together. It kind of has this accessible, quick playing vibe to it. And to this day, there have been maybe 35 publicly available remakes done, as well as hundreds more attempted. So I kind of figured that that I did actually have something here with this design that I didn't appreciate at the time. And it was going to be something that I'm returning to now, of course, with Chaos Reborn, which I will talk about a little later. But so it's interesting how many that years after this game was first published, I only then began to appreciate what it actually was doing. So I guess if you like, the lessons that I can draw from part one is a little bit about prototyping, I guess. So the original board game that I made very quickly, and it's probably took me more time actually coloring and drawing all the creatures than it did anything else in the actual design phase. But I played it with friends, and it was very good. And if you like, that board game became the prototype of the computer version that I developed later. And I've done lots of prototypes in the past, and I kind of, a good rule, a good guide, I guess, is to prototype a game in 2 weeks or less. 3 weeks maybe, depends on the type of game you're doing, but I think 4 weeks is really pushing it. And if it's neither fun nor replayable, then you just got to throw it away and go on to something else. Now, I emphasize replayable a bit here because it depends on your type of game. With the type of games that I'm doing, replayability is very important. If you're doing a puzzle game, for example, you have to, I think with your prototype, you have to prove that it's extensible, that you can actually keep adding the variety and interest from your, it should be visible from your prototype that you can extend it. And of course also keep it as simple and accessible as possible. And if you put some constraints like making it a board game that you have to do in 2 weeks or having to do it in 2 weeks, that will actually put an interesting constraint on the complexity of what you can do. And accessible is all about how easy it is for the player, the usability of the interface and so on. And this would be my approach to how to develop games from the start. I'll come back to that again a bit later on. And I've also put here, a generous dose of randomness when used correctly can actually make your game more accessible and fun. Chaos has a lot of randomness in it. It's perhaps a little bit controversial with strategy games because a lot of hardcore strategy gamers like this element of control that they have over the environment. A lot of hardcore gamers in general like the sense of control. They don't like randomness to interfere with their probability of success. But I think you'll find with a large number of players, elements of randomness can make the game more accessible because it can include people. It doesn't mean that the less skilled players are completely left out of the game, for example. So I think you have to bear that in mind with any design that you're doing of almost any type of game, except for maybe very linear puzzle games and linear adventure games. But it's still, I think, a good piece of advice. Okay, so now part two. So we're moving on a few years now, and we've got to the terror of the chrysalids. And the chrysalids were, of course, a creature that was created as part of my game XCOM. But the interesting thing about XCOM is that it really was an evolution of games. So even going all the way back to 1984, which is before Chaos that we were talking about earlier, I was developing these two-player turn-based tactical games, and each one of these games was adding a little bit more in terms of features and scope, all the way up to Laser Squad in 1988. And this evolutionary process was pretty cool because I was building in feedback from players as well as I was developing. And that led us ultimately to making a demo which we called Laser Squad 2, and it was a demo made on the Atari ST computer. And this demo we took to Microprose, and we chose Microprose because we considered them, the best publisher in the world, basically, because they published Railroad Tycoon and very, and Civilization, of course, had just come out at the time we approached Microprose. So we had this demo, and it was just a two-player sort of little turn-based tactical combat game. Now, the interesting thing was that Microprose UK were looking for a game that can, match the level of quality of Civilization and, match the level that the US parent company was developing, because the UK games division of Microprose were considered like the toy division. You know, they were doing like console stuff, and the Americans had a very low opinion of the UK company to actually produce interesting games. So one of the first things they said to us when I showed them the demo was that they actually wanted a much bigger game, something. Well, they didn't say exactly like Civilization, but they said, you know, it had to be a game as big as Civilization, and you can interpret big however you want. I mean, I assumed they wanted something that had a lot of depth, a lot of complexity, and they also wanted it based on the theme of UFOs invading Earth. They were big fans of this TV series, Jerry Anderson's UFO, which was sort of popular in the late 70s. And I then, I thought these ideas were great, by the way. I went and watched a few videos of UFO. Wasn't that interested in the aliens in it, but the basic idea of this organization, Shadow, as it was in UFO, which was set up to invade, to attack the invading UFOs as they came into the Earth's atmosphere with their airplanes, and then intercept them on the ground. You know, these ideas made it into XCOM. And I also did my own research. In particular, I got some ideas from this book, Alien Liaison by Timothy Good, and this was all about how allegedly the US government was capturing UFOs and reverse engineering the technology. So this idea of reverse engineering captured technology became also a core part of the UFO experience. So ultimately, this is how XCOM came into being. In other words, it's kind of an interesting collaboration between, you know, what we had as a game, which was Laser Squad 2, and what Microprose UK wanted in terms of their ambition to compete with the US outfit. And you know, they had these ideas that they had were very good. So things came together, and we had a very strong idea for what the game was about. You know, I produced a design document, and it wasn't a very long design document, but interestingly, you know, the final game was very close to that original document. The reasons for the game's success, well, you can talk about a lot of things. I guess, you know, the interaction of the strategic and the tactical game was quite unusual and original for its time. So, you know, Laser Squad 2, our tactical bit, became the tactical game in XCOM, and the management part had this unique global view. Oh, excuse me. My voice was giving out now. Okay, this was a big factor. You can talk about the RPG elements. Again, a very important factor for many players about nurturing, building their soldiers, and then deploying in battle. Another big factor in the game, of course, was the suspension and you know, the suspense, the tension, and the fear of the game. The chrysalids here being the most scary monster in the game, because they would impregnate your soldiers and turn them into zombies, which would then erupt into new chrysalids. Inspired by the films Alien and Aliens here. The idea of night missions and aliens hiding in the dark was all part of the aspects that made the game successful. But one thing I must say, actually, the game was actually cancelled. So even though I put at the top here, you know, sometimes things just come together and work. And, you know, the team that we had working on the game was great. The original collaboration on the concept at the beginning was great. And, you know, there was an element of zeitgeist because, you know, the X-Files was just appearing on TV just before the game was released, for example, which drew on some of the same inspirations that went into the game. But as I say, the game was actually cancelled because in 1993, Microprose was taken over by a company called Spectrum Holobyte. And Spectrum Holobyte, they made flight sims. And they looked at an early version of XCOM, and they told Microprose UK to can the game. But the UK management of Microprose actually refused to obey this instruction, and they kept the game going, which is how it survived. I didn't know any of this at the time. So with a lot of things, you know, looking back on it in hindsight, I would have to say that a lot of things came together that I didn't actually have much control over. You know, serendipity, this idea of, you know, fortunate accidental discoveries can play a big part. So, and again, this goes for a rule of thumb, I guess, that you should always look for opportunities to collaborate, especially when there's something, you know, potential interesting, some interesting synergy, and try as best as possible to make your own luck. And when I say make your own luck, it means that you've got to not be discouraged by failures, but you've got to constantly look for new opportunities that arise in your professional career as game developers. And, you know, having a strong vision for a game can really help. I put that so. And again, I think is a big factor in the success of the XCOM, that original vision that we put together in collaboration with Microprose. I had a very strong idea of how the game would work. Now, as I said, the final game was very close to that initial design document that I created. This really helped. But there is a caveat here, and that's especially if the development isn't interfered with, because in a way we were lucky also during the development of XCOM that I had absolutely no interference in what I was doing in terms of design and implementing the game. The producer from Microprose was so laid back that basically what we did when he came to visit once a month is that we went down the pub, we drank a beer, and we talked about the game, and he went home again. And, you know, that was it. And it kind of, this doesn't happen anymore. And probably this was the last game that I've worked with, done for a publisher where I've had this situation, and because subsequently things got a lot more difficult. Again, I don't know how you can engineer this situation these days, but back when we were working on XCOM, that was, I think, a big benefit for us. Okay, so now part 3, I'm moving on a little bit in my career. And in 2006, in November 2006, I joined Ubisoft, Ubisoft Sofia, as it were, because I moved to Sofia at this time in Bulgaria. And I joined Ubisoft because I was on my own. I was just working on some ideas and stuff, but I really missed working with a team. So I thought maybe joining a studio would give me some opportunity to work with a team of developers again. And the first game that I worked on was this, which doesn't look that impressive, actually. This was Chess Master for the DS. I was initially employed as the game designer on Chess Master, which was a bit bizarre because I thought the game of chess had already been designed. But what Ubisoft wanted was a game like brain training, because Ubisoft was obsessed with Nintendo. They were obsessed with brain training, and they came up with this phrase called real-life benefits. And they said to me, and this is the sentence below that they used, the game must have scientifically proven real-life benefits. You know, it must improve your, in this case, you can see here, we've got analytical reasoning, memory, and focus. Now, I would have to say that I thought this was completely nonsense. There's no way, you know, that there are scientifically proven real-life benefits to chess, to learning chess on the Nintendo DS. And it caused me a lot of problems. And, you know, these 3 things that you come at here, analytical reasoning, memory, focus, this was invented by some other guy at Ubisoft, and we had to figure out a way of making it work within the game. Of course, it was all completely bogus. I mean, there was no way that we were proving any of these things, and I, you know, thought it was a bit silly. And we had to include this guy up here, Josh Waitskin. He'd written a book. He's a chess grandmaster, and he'd written a book called The Art of Learning. And he'd come up with some really helpful phrases like, you know, nice moves. Next time we will see if we can improve your focus power. And, you know, to be honest, I've never worked on such nonsense in my entire life. I and this was my introduction to working within the confines of a big publisher after being essentially, being indie or having my own development studio for so many years. And it was a bizarre experience. It's not that I didn't learn anything useful, but it wasn't a particularly creative part of my career, those first 2 years at Ubisoft, until I got so fed up with this real-life benefits nonsense that I decided to do something about it, and I came up with a pitch for the Ubisoft editorial board, which was a game, a turn-based strategy game, which I call XCOM meets Ghost Recon for Nintendo 3DS, Nintendo DS at the time. Now, I deliberately picked Ghost Recon because I was looking for a game which might be suitable for a turn-based game. Nintendo DS because that's what the studio were experienced with at the time. We were doing only DS and PSP games at the time with an occasional PC game port. And they accepted this pitch, and I thought, great, okay, so we spent 2 months doing a prototype, and we had a playable prototype. We presented it to the editorial board, and they said, no, this is not what we want. I said, well, this is the game I pitched to you. And I said, no, for a Nintendo DS, it has to be like Advance Wars, because this is the only strategy game that's going to sell on DS. If it's not like Advance Wars, you can forget it. What you've made is too much like a PC game. So again, this is another introduction to how things might work in a big publisher, by the way, in case you haven't experienced this kind of thing before. But they did have a point, and the thing was that, Advance Wars, it's a fantastic series of games. I really enjoyed it. I was really blown away when I played the first Advance Wars. So I kind of thought, yeah, it did have some sense what they were saying, but of course Advance Wars was a very different game to, the kind of turn-based tactical element. So what I decided to do was start by cloning in particular the Advance Wars interface, how the control over the game works, and then within that constraint, try and develop a new set of game mechanics for this sort of little squad-based, turn-based combat. And this became Ghost Recon Shadow Wars, which was published for the Nintendo 3DS, because we moved from DS to 3DS. And it was a launch title, so it's actually the second highest rated launch title, which is very good. So the game did quite well in the end, and I was quite happy with the core mechanics of the game. Even though for a large part of the development actually was done purely on the PC, interestingly. We were programming it on PC with XNA, and the idea, because we had some issues with the engine on the DS, and then when we switched to moving to 3DS, we didn't have any development kits. So actually the whole game, the prototype was kind of extended, so that the whole game was actually implemented on the PC first, and we actually ported it to the 3DS. Interesting approach. And the next slide is a bit about prototyping, I think. Ah, yes, so here we are. So this is actually the Ghost Recon Shadow Wars prototype, and it's completely paper-based prototype. The game board was from another game, and I made these little counters, and this is what we used to prototype the core game mechanics. I sort of designed it and made it within a day, and we spent several days testing it, doing a bit of refinement. I think the prototype, as far as I'm concerned, was proved within a week. So the core mechanics of the whole game were done without any computers in less than a week. And which is again going back to this approach about how you do prototypes, how important they can be to validate your core gameplay experience or gameplay mechanics before you progress any further. And what we had here was very simple, and it was great. It became the foundation of the game, and I'm glad we did it that way. So some lessons from my little experience working with Ubisoft. So I put here, don't let technical excuses stop you prototyping. So I had some issues at the beginning of Ghost Recon Shadow Wars because some of the players were saying, oh, we should start implementing stuff straight away on the Nintendo DS. I said, well, we should prototype on the DS. And I said, well, no, it's going to take us too long. So actually, we started, I said, with the pen and paper prototype. And then in the next 2 weeks, we had the first prototype working on the PC running in XNA. And that was a very successful start for the game, and we kept up this process of developing releases every 2 to 3 weeks. I say accessibility is important for any game. There's this one thing I learned at Ubisoft was that their definition of accessibility is a combination of usability, interface usability, learnability of the game, as I put it, how easy it is for the player to learn to play the game without being put off at any stage right from the go. They emphasize very heavily the first 5 minutes of gameplay. In fact, Ubisoft was so obsessed with accessibility, some of the games that they made were all accessibility and no game. I mean, it's quite shocking some of the things they actually did. But nonetheless, it is a useful lesson to learn, and you need to study it, and you need to think of many different ways to do it. One of the things we did actually with Ghost Recon Shadow Wars is that when we had our releasable versions, we tested them always on people who had never played the game before, and we observed them doing it. I got different members of the team to observe people playing it. So we always had 2 observers, and these observers were different members of the team each time. Sometimes we had some game designers doing this more consistently. And every release that we made, every 2 to 3 weeks, we were doing this test. And we ran out of people in the studio to test it on. It wasn't necessarily exactly our core audience, but so another thing is show a playable version of a game every 2 to 3 weeks. And we had a cycle. We're using a Scrum development system, and we had a sprint review every 2 to 3 weeks. And I did this in front of the whole team. So we would show the playable version. We'd show the work also that everybody else had been working on, but there was a lot of focus on maintaining that playable version at all costs. Mostly we did it every 2 weeks. Sometimes we had some hiccups. It was we had a 3-week break, sometimes a 4-week break, but that was a very good process. Everybody appreciated it. And the next thing here, clone and then innovate. So what we did with, say, Ghost Recon Shadow Wars was, again, to clone the Advanced Wars interface, but then innovate on the other game mechanics. And that worked very well, and we tried to keep things absolutely as simple as necessary for the player. And finally, I put the value of constraints for creative innovation. So, the right kind of constraints for a creative team can result in some really good creative work. If you give a team of developers no constraints over, time, budget, resources, you will end up with a huge mess, literally. I mean, I guarantee you will end up with a mess because so many people will be pulling so many different directions that you won't even be able to manage. So the constraints that you put on are very important. So again, going back to the constraint that I put on a team, that we are going to have an interface which works like the Advanced Wars interface was a constraint that I put on the game. And it limited what we could do also with the game design mechanics, but it ultimately was a very useful constraint. So, on to the next part. Okay, Indie Reborn. As you can probably guess, this is my career with Ubisoft ended after 5.5 years working there. My last project was Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation for PS Vita. But I left after a year. I was creative director on that project. But I wanted to get back to doing the thing that I loved, which was turn-based tactical games. So, actually, just as a question, I guess, to the audience here, how many of you are indie developers? A good number. How many of you have done or are considering to do some kind of crowdfunding for your game? Not many. Okay. Well, if you're considering it, then this next bit might be useful for you. There's an awful lot I could say about it, but let's see. So, Chaos Reborn. Now, my new project is going all the way back to that first game I talked about, Chaos, and is essentially a remake or reimagining of that game And I gave myself a constraint here, and the constraint was that the core mechanics of the original Chaos will be retained as they are. And then I would build on this to make a game which had a big single-player campaign, it had multiplayer options and social features and so on, but at its core, it would still have those same game mechanics that work so well in the original. And if you like, it's a bit of a challenge or a test to myself about how to do this process. And recently we had a Kickstarter campaign, and this is what my Kickstarter campaign looked like. And we had a goal of $180,000, and you can see it went very well at the beginning. And it was struggling by this point where I was, it seemed to be completely leveling off about 5 days before the end. And then all of a sudden, the pledges shot upwards, and I was just amazed about what was happening. I didn't know where all these people were suddenly coming from. We were getting something like 20, 30 pledges an hour right up to the last minute. And it was a very, very interesting experience. So I'll tell you some of the things that I learned from this experience. One thing, by the way, this big bump at the beginning, I'd done a lot of work on PR and promoting the game and my blog and on Twitter. I tried to get journalists looking at the game, so I got coverage in print magazines and online magazines. For me, this was perhaps an easier process than for most because of my history, and journalists were interested in what I was doing anyway. But still, it was a lot of work. I even delayed the Kickstarter from the previous summer. It was going to be in February this year. Then I delayed it 6 weeks again, all because I didn't think that the PR was sufficient yet. So if you're considering doing a crowdfunding route, you have to do your PR and promotion consistently months before you even start. So bear that in mind. And that resulted in that big jump at the beginning. And that got the project noticed, and it gets your project also featured in the front page or some of the top pages on Kickstarter, which also helps. So that was useful. So interestingly, with Kickstarter projects and other crowdfunding projects, you've got these different reward levels that you have to fulfill. And I did something a little bit interesting and different, and that was to have rewards which were game-related, digitally game-related. And you had like Wizard Lords, Wizard King, and Demigods. These were all like roles within the game that you could buy. And you would have that role permanently. And players could get these roles by playing the game enough. But as a backer, you got this reward straight away. So inevitably, this resulted in this whole controversy about, is the game pay to win? And it's a big issue with lots of free-to-play games, of course. And so I had to do a lot of explaining here. And the thing I had to explain is that in a way, it's not pay to win because your wizard is no better than any other player's wizard if you pay for these rewards. You're just as likely to lose a battle as anybody else. You have to go through the whole process of building your wizard and your experience and your equipment just like anybody else. But what I tried to do here was actually give these, what you got with these rewards is an interesting social role. For example, Wizard Kings can create their own realms, demigods run their own guilds, and gods, well, they have to attract worshippers and so on. So, but I think it worked out in the end because you can see here, those percentages, by the way, are the percentage amount of the total pledges in dollars that come from those rewards. So most of our pledges come from people backing at higher reward levels. So I think it worked in practice, but again, it's something you have to be very careful if you're trying to do anything like this with your game. And so yes, here comes the next big issue which I faced during the Kickstarter campaign. It's the problem of the prototype that became a half-baked demo. Now, as you know, I'm very strong about building prototypes that are very rough and ready, and I programmed a playable prototype of Chaos Reborn quite early on, and it had very basic graphics. And I had an artist helping me with making the placeholder graphics, and I had to turn down his designs because I said they look too good. You know, I want something that looks like Minecraft. It's got to look like a prototype. Still, I think he did things which were too good. But then we wanted to create screenshots for the game, so we created we developed some of the creatures. Some of the creatures you can see here, the giant, the manticore, and the wizard and the dwarf. These were developed with proper models. And the terrain, we had some much more high quality environments there. But the rest of the graphics were a bit basic still. So it's a mixture of our prototype graphics and our screenshot graphics. And I was worried that people would assume that this was the way the game was supposed to look from the prototype. You know, there's no way that you can stop people thinking this. And as it turned out, it wasn't such a big problem. And also, you can see the interface is just the bog standard Unity, you know, Gooey stuff, which looks pretty crap. But I would say the prototype was very functional. It had a lot of user interface feedback. You know, it had sound effects. So it was a highly playable game, even though it was multiplayer only. And it did demonstrate the core gameplay, I think, well. But I was worried about this whole presentation issue. So I was trying to get YouTubers to play the game with me so they could show it on their channel. Of course, I thought, well, you know, I'm not sure how it's going to go down. Again, watching a game being played, especially a turn-based game, is very boring. You know, you're watching nothing happening while somebody's trying to decide what they're going to do. Excuse me. So what I decided to do about 10 days before the end of the campaign was actually release the prototype to the public so everybody could play it. First the backers and then public. And this proved to be a very good move because actually I'll just move on to the next slide. This is all about exposure. Anyway, it proved to be a very good move because the backers were very happy with being able to play the demo, and they really enjoyed it, which was great. And they were talking about it, the number of comments on Kickstarter shot up, and they started trying to push the prototype with friends and everybody else they made, and they became my PR team, if you like, trying to promote the game, and I think it made a huge difference. And my fears about the half-baked demo were not really founded. And it got us some more exposure, of course. And talking about the exposure for your game, and this I think is more of a general point now, who really makes a difference in terms of getting your game noticed and getting it publicized. So, I mean, from our point of view, Rock, Paper, Shotgun, which is a website, is way more influential than any other games website by a huge margin for our campaign, for sure. Obviously, it depends on your type of game. So, obviously, RPS are much more PC focused as a games website, but they're hugely influential. Reddit, again, enormously influential. So, I did a Reddit AMA, and that had a significant boost in awareness of the game. It was very helpful. And again, from my point of view, because I'm known for XCOM, everyone wants to talk about XCOM, but that was an advantage I had, of course. So I tried to use the XCOM connection as much as I could. And oh yeah, Total Biscuit, he makes a difference. So, but the interesting thing is that Total Biscuit is a YouTube guy who has, I don't know, 1.5 million subscribers. So anything he puts on his channel is going to be viewed a huge amount. And eventually he agreed to show the game. In this case, he recorded a game with me and Ken Levine. But it was on the last day of the campaign. It was the day after we'd actually reached our funding goal. So he didn't have an impact on our actual funding goal, but he did have a big impact on the huge number of players that started to actually play the prototype, which was publicly released at that time. And I encountered a lot of players playing the prototype who had just seen the Total Biscuit video. So the interesting about the YouTubers, though, is that a lot of them have specializations, and if you find the right ones to cover your game, a lot of them cover indie games, for example, then they can make more difference than any of the big games websites, to be honest. Okay, so this is my final slide. I am just trying to draw out just a few conclusions, I think, from some of the things that I've done over the years. So I put here, be a good collaborator when advantageous, but don't suppress your individual creativity. So working in games development, and in fact many creative areas, is all about a balance between collaboration and creativity. A lot of creative types work best, actually, alone without interference. And they can get very confused and then sidetracked if lots of people are trying to pull them in different directions. You know, I was a bit like this. I created my game, but what I did then was I exposed my game to my friends and my family, and I really valued that kind of feedback. So however individual your creativity is, you still need to get that feedback. I knew some of my best projects, like, again, going back to the origin of XCOM, was actually a collaboration between me and Microprose on the whole design and high-level vision of the game. So for indies, PR should be constantly worked on. Yeah, it's kind of obvious, I guess, but I didn't realize how important this really was until I did the Kickstarter campaign, and you have to do it months before, during, and months after. It has to be constantly going on, and you need to research it and work on it pretty hard. I had obviously a lot of advantages, but I did put a lot of work into it, though. And then, fun, replayable prototypes with good presentation will help enormously. Now, the caveat here is the presentation doesn't have to be part of the prototype. Your prototype can look very rough and ready, but show the gameplay. And presentation-wise, you can do something separate in terms of like a non-interactive demo or non-interactive video or whatever it is. Because presentation still has a huge impact when it comes to crowdfunding and getting attention. I can't deny it. And finally, long-lived turn-based strategy games. I guess. And the point here I'm trying to make is that if you're creating your own games, you need to find some kind of niche or area which is not that well explored, perhaps. You need to have something which has a bit of innovation that somebody hasn't done before, and try and get some unique hook to your game that you can use to attract players and attract the PR and attention that you need to make your game a success. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. Do we have some time for questions at all?
If we have any very important right now questions that have to be asked, so please raise your hand right now. If not, I would encourage you to just ask Julian during the breaks. Here we have one question, yeah? Okay. There's a microphone.
Thanks for the talk, really interesting. So you talked a lot about being, XCOM's Julian Gollop and how that helped you in terms of being successful on Kickstarter. Do you ever think about how it might have gone if you weren't XCOM's Julian Gollop? I know it's an odd question, but obviously most people in the audience don't have that to support them.
Correct. It would have been 10 times tougher for sure. Really much tougher. And crowdfunding is just very difficult. I mean, it's a lot more difficult now on Kickstarter than it was a year ago or 2 years ago. That's the reality. It really is very tough. And you should look at the games which are doing well on Kickstarter and figure out why they're doing well. And again, your goal, unfortunately, has to be quite low, otherwise you're not going to reach it. You have to be realistic. It's tough.
I mean, just as a quick secondary, because a couple of years ago you had Tim Schafer and Brian Fargo.
Yeah.
Do you ever wonder how much you might have made if you'd actually got stuck in 18 months ago, maybe?
Oh yeah, a lot more. Absolutely. Many people have told me this. Brian Fargo has told me this as well. Chris Roberts told me this as well. They said, it's not going to be as easy as it was, and it's true.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I think that you will join me thanking Julian.